Jack Foster had always considered himself a man of the open plains. As a cowboy, he was accustomed to traveling alone, moving from town to town, living off the land and working hard to make a living. One fateful day, his routine was interrupted by a severe storm. The wind howled fiercely across the desert, and rain came down in sheets, drenching everything in its path. Jack had been riding his wagon, hauling goods to a distant town when the storm hit. In a matter of moments, the heavy winds overturned his wagon, scattering supplies across the rocky desert ground. He tried to salvage what he could, but the storm was too powerful and there was no way to fix the damage. Stranded in the middle of nowhere, Jack knew he had to act fast. The storm would soon pass, but he was left with limited options. The nearest town was a full day's ride away, and his horse was in no condition to carry him that far. His only hope was to find shelter and wait out the storm, hoping the weather would clear enough for him to make his way to safety. As Jack walked through the rain, trying to find some kind of shelter, he noticed a movement in the distance. At first he thought it might be a mirage, but then, as the rain began to slow, he could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman. She was standing tall against the storm, her figure outlined against the fading light. Jack squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't just any woman. It was an Apache woman dressed in traditional clothing with a serious look on her face. Jack had heard stories of the Apache, of their reputation for being fierce and independent, and he knew better than to approach them without caution. For a moment, Jack hesitated. He had heard of tensions between the Apache and settlers like himself, and though he wasn't one to judge a person by their heritage, he knew the situation could easily turn dangerous. But something about this woman made him feel like he wasn't in immediate danger. She didn't seem threatening. Rather, she seemed to be surveying him from a distance as though weighing her options. "Are you lost?" the woman asked, her voice carrying over the dying winds. Jack blinked in surprise. Her English was clear, though her accent was thick. It wasn't common to hear the Apache speak like this, but then again, not everyone in the desert lived the way he did. I'm in a bit of trouble," Jack admitted, realizing how foolish he must have sounded. "My wagon's wrecked and my horse is hurt. I was hoping to find some shelter until the storm passes." The woman studied him for a long moment. Jack could see the wheels turning in her mind as she considered his words. After what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. "Follow me," she said simply, turning away without waiting for him to respond. Jack was surprised but didn't hesitate. There was no other option, and though he was wary, he felt a strange sense of trust toward this woman. She led him through the desert, and though the storm had mostly cleared, the air still felt thick and heavy with moisture. Jack tried to keep up with her, but she moved with the ease of someone completely at home in the harsh desert environment. Jack, on the other hand, felt like an outsider, struggling to stay on his feet as the mud made every step more difficult. They reached a small cave tucked into the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter from the wind and the rain, and for the time being, that was all Jack needed. As he ducked inside, he noticed that it wasn't entirely empty. There were signs of life, rough blankets and a small fire pit, along with a few pieces of equipment Jack didn't recognize. It was clear that this woman, whoever she was, had made this place her home. She gestured for him to sit by the fire. "You can rest here," she said. "I will gather some food for you." Jack hesitated, wondering how he could repay her kindness. "I don't want to impose," he said. "I can find my own way." The woman turned to him, her face unreadable. "You will not survive alone out there," she said bluntly. "The desert can be unforgiving. I will help you, but you must listen and learn." Jack knew better than to argue with someone who seemed to understand the desert better than he ever could. He had heard stories of the Apache's deep connection to the land, how they could track animals for miles, how they knew every shift in the wind and every sign the earth offered. And here he was, stuck, relying on the help of an Apache woman who clearly knew more about survival than he did. As the woman left to find food, Jack sat by the fire, taking in his surroundings. The cave was a small, humble place, but it felt like a refuge from the world outside. The warmth of the fire soothed his cold, tired bones, and for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't long before the woman returned, carrying a small bundle of herbs and dried meat. She set it down in front of him and began to prepare the food in silence. Jack watched her, fascinated by how at ease she seemed, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the wild. After a while, Jack couldn't help but ask, "How did you learn to survive out here?" The woman paused, her hands stilling for a moment. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her eyes focused on the fire. "I was taught by the land," she said simply. "The desert has its ways. If you learn to listen, it will teach you everything you need to know." Jack nodded slowly, impressed by the simplicity and wisdom of her words. He had spent his life as a cowboy, but in all his years of riding the plains, he had never fully understood the deeper connection the people of the desert had with their environment. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about living in harmony with the land, understanding its rhythms and respecting its power. For the next few days, Jack stayed with the Apache woman, whose name he learned was Taji. She taught him the basics of survival in the desert, how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, and how to tell when the weather was changing. Jack was amazed at how much he didn't know. He had always considered himself resourceful, but Taji's knowledge was on a whole different level. Taji in turn seemed curious about Jack's life as a cowboy. She asked him questions about the world beyond the desert, about the towns he visited and the people he encountered. Over time, their conversations grew deeper, and Jack began to realize that Taji wasn't just helping him because of his predicament. She saw something in him, something that made her believe he was worth teaching. As the days passed, Jack grew stronger, more capable of navigating the desert on his own. But he also noticed something else. He felt a growing respect for Taji, for her strength, her resilience, and her intelligence. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. One evening, as the sun set and painted the desert sky with vibrant colors, Jack sat by the fire with Taji. He turned to her and said, "You've taught me a lot more than I ever expected to learn. I don't know how to thank you." Taji's lips curled into a small smile. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "You are a good student, Jack, but there is still more for you to learn." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had come to this desert as a lost cowboy, but now with Taji's guidance, he was learning to see the world in a new light. He was beginning to understand the desert and the people who called it home in ways he never thought possible. Little did he know, the lessons Taji was teaching him would soon become far more important than anything he had ever learned as a cowboy. Over the next few days, Jack settled into a routine with Taji. He learned not only how to survive in the desert, but also how to respect it in a way he hadn't before. The desert wasn't just a barren, endless expanse. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded attention and understanding. The more Jack worked with Taji, the more he came to admire her for her deep connection to this harsh land. She knew its rhythms and secrets, things that had never crossed Jack's mind before. Every morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they would begin their day. Jack had always been an early riser, but now he found himself waiting eagerly for the lessons Taji would bring. The first thing Jack learned was how to read the desert like a book. Taji taught him how to notice the subtle signs left behind by animals, the way the sand was disturbed in just a certain way, how the tracks of a deer or rabbit could tell you not only where it had been, but also when and why. She explained how to find water, not just by seeking out obvious sources like streams, but by looking for small depressions in the land where rainwater collected, or by noting where plants grew in abundance, indicating moisture deep below the surface. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the cool desert night had taken over, they would sit by the fire and share stories. Taji spoke very little about her past at first, and Jack didn't press her. He knew that in her own time, she would share what she was ready to. In return, Jack told her about his life as a cowboy, about the towns he had traveled to, the cattle drives he had been part of, and the struggles he had faced with other settlers. His stories fascinated her, and over time, Taji began to open up about her own life. She told Jack about her people, the Apache, and how they had lived in harmony with the land for generations. But she also spoke of the hardships her tribe had faced, of the way their way of life had been disrupted by settlers, soldiers, and the constant push for more land. She didn't speak with bitterness, but there was a quiet sorrow in her words. Jack realized that Taji's deep connection to the desert wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving a way of life that had been slowly disappearing over the years. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of a small cliff, Jack couldn't help but ask, "What's your goal, Taji? I mean, why are you out here alone in the desert?" Why not live with your people? Taji was silent for a long time, her eyes staring into the distance. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but steady. My people are not the same as they were. There is too much pain in our past. Many of them live in fear of what the future might bring. I chose to be here to find peace, to learn from the land. I didn't want to be tied to the past. I wanted to find something new. Jack nodded, understanding more than he expected. He had seen people carry the weight of the past with them, and how it could change the way they lived. I can respect that, he said quietly. Taji looked at him then, her gaze sharp and clear. You understand, Jack, because you're learning too. You're learning to listen to the land, to respect it. The way you respect your past might be different than mine, but you too are finding your way. That moment left Jack thoughtful. He hadn't realized how much he had been learning, not just about survival but about himself. The desert, with all its danger and solitude, had a way of forcing people to face who they really were. He had come to the desert thinking of it as just a place to pass through, another obstacle in his journey. But now, he saw it as a teacher, a place where both his physical and spiritual strength would be tested. As the days passed, Taji began to introduce Jack to new skills. She showed him how to craft simple tools from the resources of the desert, how to weave baskets from desert grasses, how to fashion arrows from sticks and bones, and how to make a bow strong enough to hunt small game. Jack wasn't sure at first if he could learn such delicate work, but Taji's patience was endless. She would guide his hands, showing him the right way, but always letting him try first. At times his hands would shake in frustration, but Taji would only smile and tell him to try again. The land is patient, she would say, and so must we be. But the most important lesson Jack learned came when Taji asked him to teach her how to shoot. At first, Jack wasn't sure how to respond. He had never considered teaching anyone else how to use a rifle. It was a tool he had always used alone, something that helped him provide for himself and protect his livelihood. But Taji's request intrigued him. She wasn't asking out of curiosity or necessity. She was asking to learn because she wanted to become stronger, more self-sufficient. I need to protect myself. Jack, she said one evening after they had finished a long day of training, the desert isn't the only danger. There are those who would hurt my people. I want to learn so I can defend myself. Jack saw the sincerity in her eyes and realized that this wasn't just about a skill. It was about empowering herself, gaining the ability to protect those she cared for. It was the same way he had felt when he first learned how to handle a rifle as a boy. It was about survival, yes, but also about independence. For the next few days, Jack took it slow. He started with the basics, how to hold the rifle, how to steady one's hands, how to align the sights. Taji was a quick learner, her hands sure and steady from years of working with the land. She didn't flinch when the rifle kicked back, and she listened intently as Jack explained how to judge distance, how to account for wind, how to focus on a moving target. Jack was impressed by how quickly she absorbed everything. In a short time, Taji became nearly as skilled as Jack, hitting targets with remarkable accuracy. There was a quiet power in the way she handled the rifle, and Jack found himself growing more and more impressed by her determination. She wasn't just learning to shoot, she was learning to stand tall, to face whatever challenges came her way. She was learning to fight for herself and for her people. One evening, as they practiced under the setting sun, Taji turned to Jack and asked, "Why did you agree to teach me?" Jack paused, looking at her. It was a question he had been asking himself for a while. He hadn't expected to teach anyone, especially not an Apache woman, yet here they were, standing side by side, learning from one another. "I guess I never thought about it much," Jack admitted. "Maybe it's because I see how much you care about protecting your people. I respect that, and I know what it's like to need to protect yourself." Taji smiled, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Jack. You are the first person who has ever treated me as an equal." Jack was silent for a moment, moved by her words. He had come to the desert looking for survival, but in the process he had found something much more powerful: respect, partnership, and an unexpected bond. As the days passed, Jack and Taji grew closer, united by the common purpose of survival and a mutual respect that was rare between people from different worlds. The desert, which had once seemed so vast and indifferent, now felt like a place they both understood. But little did they know, Danger was slowly creeping toward them, and their newfound partnership would soon be put to the test in ways neither of them expected. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light across the dry land, Jack and Taji were sitting by the fire when they noticed something unusual. A small dust cloud appeared in the distance, moving steadily toward them. Jack squinted, his instincts kicking in. "It's a group of riders," he said, his voice low. "Looks like they're heading this way." Taji's eyes narrowed. She had lived in the desert long enough to know when trouble was coming, and this didn't feel like a casual group of travelers. There was something about the way they moved, too quick, too deliberate, that told her these riders weren't here for friendly reasons. They were coming with purpose, and that purpose wasn't good. Jack quickly scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of where they could go. The small cave they had made their temporary home wasn't a good place to hide. It was too exposed. "We need to move. Get everything packed." Taji nodded without hesitation. She was already on her feet, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as she worked quickly to gather their belongings. The bond between them was clear now. No words were needed. They both knew what to do. As they worked, Jack kept his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. They were getting closer, moving fast across the dry, dusty landscape. Taji grabbed her bow and quiver of arrows, strapping them to her back. She didn't need to say anything. Jack knew that she was ready for whatever came next. He strapped on his rifle, checking it quickly to make sure it was loaded and ready. They weren't looking for a fight, but they had to be prepared in case things took a dangerous turn. As they finished packing their things, the riders were almost upon them. Jack and Taji slipped into the cover of the rocks and bushes, staying low to avoid being seen. They watched silently as the riders came into view. There were 6 of them, rough-looking men on horseback, their faces set with determination. Jack could tell by the way they rode that they were experienced and not in a friendly way. These men weren't simply passing through. They were here with a plan, and that plan likely involved causing trouble. The riders didn't stop or slow down as they neared the cave. Instead, they began to circle the area, clearly searching for something or someone. Jack's heart began to race. He had no doubt now that these men were trouble. They could be outlaws, bandits, or worse. He didn't know their intentions yet, but he wasn't about to wait around and find out. Taji, however, was calm. She'd seen this before. She knew the desert was full of dangers, and these men were just one more challenge to face. "Stay quiet," Taji whispered to Jack. Her voice was steady and her eyes never left the riders. She was ready for whatever might come next, but Jack wasn't sure how they were going to get out of this. There were too many of them, and their horses were fast. If it came to a chase, they wouldn't stand a chance. Jack stayed low, gripping his rifle tightly. He couldn't help but feel a surge of fear at the thought of being captured or worse, but he reminded himself that Taji was with him. She had proven herself to be strong and capable, and he would need to trust her now. The riders continued to circle, and Jack noticed they were looking more closely at the terrain. They were searching for something. Perhaps they had caught wind of their presence or had heard something they shouldn't have. Taji's hand moved to her bow, fingers lightly touching the arrows, ready to fire at a moment's notice. It was then that the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, called out, "We know you're out there. Don't make us come find you." Jack's stomach tightened. There was no question now they had been spotted. He exchanged a glance with Taji, and without a word, she gave a small nod. She was ready. Jack didn't want to fight, but if it came down to it, he knew they would have to defend themselves. The scarred leader called again, this time more urgently. "We know you're hiding, and we don't want trouble. Come out and no one will get hurt." Jack's eyes flicked to Taji. He could see her thinking, calculating their options. She wasn't afraid, and that steadied his nerves a little. She was a survivor, and in her presence Jack felt more capable than he had in a long time. But Taji didn't answer. Instead, she slowly and silently moved to a different position, sliding along the rocky outcrop toward a vantage point where she could see the riders clearly. Jack watched her go, trying to follow her every move. She was like a shadow, blending into the landscape, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the desert like the back of her hand. The leader of the group, frustrated by the silence, gestured to his men. "Search the cave," he ordered. "They can't be far." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. If they found the cave, they would find their things. And if they found their things, they would know Jack and Taji weren't far away. They couldn't let that happen. Jack motioned to Taji, signaling that they needed to move quickly. Without waiting for further instructions, Taji moved with fluid precision, pulling her bow from her back and knocking an arrow in one swift motion. She had the skill of a seasoned hunter, and her aim was true. She crept to the edge of the rocks, her eyes scanning the group of riders as they made their way toward the cave. In a flash, she released the arrow, sending it straight toward the leader of the group. The arrow flew silently through the air, and with a soft thud, it struck the leader in the shoulder. The man let out a surprised yell, grabbing at the arrow, but it was too late. He fell from his horse, crumpling to the ground. The rest of the riders immediately scattered, their horses rearing up in panic. Chaos erupted in the air as the riders tried to regroup. Jack had been waiting for this moment, and he quickly emerged from his hiding spot, rifle in hand, ready to protect himself and Taji. He aimed carefully, taking a steady breath as he focused on his target. One of the riders, seeing Jack, drew his own weapon, but before he could fire, Jack took him down with a precise shot. The rider fell off his horse, hitting the ground with a thud. The remaining outlaws hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. They were outnumbered and now outgunned. Taji didn't hesitate. She fired another arrow, knocking one of the riders from his saddle. With the leader down and two others taken out of action, the remaining men realized they were in no position to fight. They looked around, desperate to escape. Jack and Taji stood firm, neither of them speaking. There was no need for words. They had won, at least for the moment. The remaining riders, realizing they had no chance of defeating the two of them, turned their horses and fled into the desert, leaving their fallen comrades behind. Taji lowered her bow and gave Jack a brief, knowing look. He nodded at her in silent acknowledgement. They had made it through the immediate danger, but Jack knew the fight was far from over. There were still more challenges ahead. They couldn't afford to rest for long, but for now they had survived. As the dust settled and the sound of the fleeing riders faded into the distance, Jack and Taji shared a brief moment of peace. They had faced down the threat together, and their bond had grown even stronger in the process. But deep down, Jack knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much bigger fight, a fight for survival in a world that didn't always make sense. After the danger of the outlaws had passed, the desert grew eerily quiet. Jack and Taji stood amidst the scattered dust and the faint smell of gunpowder, the only signs of the battle they had just survived. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The fading light gave the desert an almost peaceful appearance, but Jack knew better. The calm that followed a storm like this was always temporary, and they couldn't afford to be complacent. Jack turned to Taji, who was already examining the fallen outlaws, her sharp eyes scanning for anything useful. "We need to move. We can't stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. Taji nodded in agreement, wiping the dust off her hands before checking her bow and arrows one more time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew the dangers of lingering too long in one spot. Taji had once told him that in the desert, you either moved with the wind or became a part of it. It was a harsh truth, but one that Jack had come to understand all too well over the past few weeks. Staying in one place for too long meant becoming a target, and now that they had dealt with these outlaws, there was no telling who else might come looking for them. The group of riders had been organized and determined, and Jack had a sinking feeling that they weren't just a random band of troublemakers. They were part of something bigger, something that might be coming after Taji's people, or perhaps even after both of them. They quickly gathered what they could from the fallen men, making sure to take anything that might be useful: water, food, ammunition, and any tools they could use. Jack found a small pouch of gold coins, which he tucked into his jacket, though he had no idea if they would be of any value in the coming days. He didn't care much for gold, but it might come in handy one day. Taji, meanwhile, was more focused on the practical items. She took one of the horses, the one that had been left behind after its rider fled, and began to saddle it, her movements quick and precise. Jack was impressed by how effortlessly Taji handled the horse. She had told him once that the Apache had always been skilled horse riders, but seeing her now, it was clear that she wasn't just skilled, she was a natural. Jack had ridden horses his entire life, but there was a difference between being a cowboy and being someone who was truly in tune with the animals they rode. Taji had a way with horses that was almost magical. Once the horse was saddled, Taji looked over at Jack and gave a small nod. "We leave now," she said. Jack agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't that he could see anyone, but the silence in the air was unnerving. It felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that came before something big was about to happen. Together they mounted their horses and set off in the direction of the Apache settlement that Taji had spoken about. It was a journey they had planned to take before the outlaws had shown up. But now, with the tension in the air, it felt more urgent than ever. Jack couldn't help but wonder about the bigger picture. The outlaws were clearly after something, but what? Had they been targeting Taji? Or had they simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? As they rode through the desert, Jack couldn't help but notice the change in Taji. She was still calm, still focused, but there was something more in her eyes now, an intensity, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just a woman who was teaching him to survive in the desert. She was someone who had lived through much more than he realized, someone who had seen the worst of what the world had to offer. Jack had never known anyone like her. Her strength, both physical and mental, was something he admired deeply. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, breaking the silence between them. Taji looked at him, her eyes steady. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed the heaviness she carried. "We must move quickly. There will be more who come." Jack frowned. "What do you mean, more who come?" Taji hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to say. "These men were part of a group," she explained. "They are not the first to come looking for us, and they won't be the last. The settlers, the soldiers, they all want something from my people. This is not the first time I've seen men like them." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had known there was tension between the settlers and the Apache, but hearing it from Taji's own lips made it all the more real. This wasn't just about a few outlaws causing trouble. It was about something much larger, a conflict that had been simmering for years and was now boiling over. Taji's words lingered in Jack's mind as they continued their ride, the dry desert air whipping past them. He couldn't help but think of his own life, of how easy it had been to move from one town to another, from one job to the next. His life had been simple, uncomplicated. But Taji's life was nothing like that. She had been caught in the middle of a battle that was far bigger than anything he could understand. After several hours of riding, they finally reached the outskirts of Taji's settlement. It was small, more of a camp than a town, nestled at the base of a rocky hill. There were only a few dwellings made from simple materials, wood, stone, and hide, along with a few animals grazing nearby. The settlement looked peaceful, but Jack could sense the tension that lingered in the air. As they rode into the camp, the people of the settlement looked up, some nodding in recognition as they saw Taji. There was a quiet strength in their eyes, but also a weariness, as if they had been expecting trouble. Jack dismounted and followed Taji toward the center of the camp. An older man with a long graying beard stepped forward. He was dressed in traditional Apache clothing, his face lined with age and experience. Taji spoke to him in a language Jack didn't understand, but the conversation was short and to the point. The man nodded, his face grim. Taji turned to Jack. "This is my father, Kotu," she said. "He is the leader of this settlement." Jack gave a small nod of respect to Kotu, who acknowledged him with a steady gaze. The older man didn't speak, but Jack could tell that there was a lot on his mind. Taji seemed to sense it too, as she quickly turned to Jack and said, "We need to talk. There's more coming and we must be prepared." Jack knew exactly what she meant. The outlaws they had dealt with were just the beginning. Whatever trouble was coming, it wasn't going to be easy to face. But Jack also knew that with Taji by his side, they had a chance. Together they had survived so much already, and whatever the future held, they would face it as a team. They had learned that much in the desert. Now they just had to figure out what came next. The air in the settlement felt heavy, charged with an uncertain future. The quiet peace that had settled over the land in the aftermath of the storm was gone, replaced by the threat of something much darker. Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding, but at the same time he felt something else, a determination to stand with Taji and the Apache people, to fight for what was right. Whatever the cost. The days following their arrival at Taji's settlement were filled with quiet tension. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he also noticed the way the Apache people were preparing. There was no panic, no frantic scrambling. Instead, there was a calm determination that came from years of facing hardship and knowing that the desert, much like life itself, was unpredictable. Taji's father, Kotu, was a man who had seen it all, and Jack couldn't help but respect the way he carried himself. He seemed to know that the future, whatever it held, had to be faced head-on. Kotu gathered the men of the settlement one evening to discuss their plans. Jack, despite being an outsider, was invited to listen. He sat at the back of the group, feeling like he was on the edge of something important. The men spoke in their native tongue, their voices low and urgent. Jack could tell they were discussing the threat they faced, but he didn't understand the specifics of what was said. Taji, however, was there beside him, translating when necessary. "The settlers are coming," she whispered, her face grim. "Not just a few. There's a whole group, and they've allied with soldiers from the fort to the north. They want the land. They believe they can take it without consequence." Jack's heart sank as he heard Taji's words. The land they were standing on was more than just dirt and rock. It was sacred to her people. It was a place where generations of Apache had lived, hunted, and fought to preserve their way of life. The thought of outsiders coming in to claim it was unthinkable, yet it seemed to be happening right before his eyes. For the next few days, Jack and Taji worked together to prepare the settlement. They didn't have much, but they used what little they had to fortify their position. Taji taught Jack more about the ways of her people, how to set up traps, how to hide their tracks, and how to move through the desert without being noticed. These were skills he had never imagined learning, but he found himself becoming more skilled with each passing day. They built makeshift barriers around the settlement, hiding their most valuable supplies and preparing hidden escape routes, just in case things went wrong. As the days went by, the tension in the settlement only grew. Jack could see the worry in Taji's eyes, though she never let it show openly. She was a woman of action, and even in the face of a potential invasion, she remained strong. Jack, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. The more he thought about the outlaws they had dealt with earlier, the more he realized that they were just a small part of a larger picture. This wasn't just about a few settlers coming to take what they wanted. It was about something much bigger, a larger conflict that had been brewing for years. One afternoon, as Jack and Taji were finishing up their preparations, they spotted riders on the horizon. This time there were more of them, far more. They were coming in from the north, their numbers stretching as far as Jack could see. Taji stood still, her eyes scanning the approaching riders. She didn't say anything at first, but Jack could see the recognition in her face. "These are the ones," she said quietly, her voice steady but with an edge of worry. "The soldiers and the settlers. They've joined forces." Jack's mind raced. The soldiers would be well armed and the settlers would know the land, perhaps even better than he did. Together they would be a formidable force. There was no doubt in Jack's mind now that the settlement would be at the heart of the coming conflict. The Apache people didn't waste time in fear or uncertainty. Instead, they immediately began to move with purpose. Kotu called for a meeting, and the people of the settlement gathered once again. The mood was serious but not defeated. There was a quiet strength in the way they carried themselves. Jack could feel it too, a sense of resolve that was rooted in the very soil beneath their feet. They would fight to protect their land, their heritage, and each other. "We will not surrender," Kotu's voice echoed across the group, his words filled with quiet authority. "We will stand together and we will protect what is ours." Taji stood beside her father, her face set in determination. Jack could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to survive in the desert and teach him how to do the same. He knew now, more than ever, that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her people, for their way of life. As the days passed, Jack and Taji continued to prepare, doing everything they could to fortify the settlement. The Apache people were masters of their land, and Jack was learning from the best. They practiced defensive strategies, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. Every night they would gather around the fire and share stories, strengthening their bond and reaffirming their shared purpose. The night before the settlers were expected to arrive, Taji took Jack aside. She looked him in the eye, her expression serious. "You've come a long way, Jack," she said. "You've learned the ways of the desert and the Apache. Tomorrow you will have to decide where you stand." Jack felt a lump in his throat. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't been sure of how to answer. He had never been one for picking sides. He had always been a cowboy, someone who went where the wind took him. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight over land or survival. It was about people, about a community that had been there long before settlers like him had arrived. "I'm with you, Taji," Jack said, his voice steady. "I don't know what the future holds, but I won't let them take this land from you." Taji nodded. Her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of the trust and respect they had built together over the past few weeks. "Thank you," she said softly. The morning came quickly and the Apache people were ready. Jack, along with Taji and her father, stood at the front of the settlement looking out toward the horizon. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The first signs of the enemy began to appear, groups of riders moving steadily toward the settlement, their outlines growing clearer with every passing minute. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about surviving the desert anymore. It was about protecting everything they had fought for. Taji stood beside him, her bow at the ready, her face calm and resolute. As the riders drew closer, the Apache people took their positions, spreading out across the land in a formation that Jack had learned well during their time together. They were ready, and though the odds were against them, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had prepared, they had trained, and they were now standing together as one. The settlers and soldiers approached, unaware of the defenses that awaited them. The first wave of riders moved into range, and Jack felt the tension rise. Then, without warning, Taji raised her bow and fired. The arrow flew through the air with deadly precision, hitting one of the riders squarely in the chest. The battle had begun. From that moment, everything seemed to happen in a blur. The Apache people fought with the fury and skill of those who had spent their lives in the desert, defending their homes and their way of life. Jack fought alongside them, using everything Taji had taught him to stand his ground. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. The battle was long and hard, but the Apache people held their ground. The settlers and soldiers, though numerous, were unprepared for the ferocity of the defense. One by one, they were pushed back, retreating into the desert as the Apache held their ground. By the time the sun began to set, the fight was over. The Apache had won. The settlers and soldiers had been driven away, their plans thwarted. But Jack knew this was only a temporary victory. The threat was far from over and the future remained uncertain. But for now they had survived. They had fought for their land and they had won. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle faded away, Jack stood alongside Taji, watching the sunset over the desert. It was a moment of peace, but Jack knew that peace was fleeting. Still, he felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. They had stood together, and together they had overcome the odds. Taji turned to him, her expression soft. "You've become one of us, Jack," she said quietly. Jack looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. "No, Taji," he replied, his voice steady. "You've taught me what it means to fight for something worth protecting. And for that, I'll always stand by you." In the fading light, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jack knew that no matter what the future held, he had found a place where he belonged, by Taji's side in a land worth fighting for.